When you do that slow and contemplative and let it build. I mean, we only have a 2-minute counter where we play a little bit of music before the show starts each day. But that particular nigun, which is the nigun of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Levi Yitzhak of Berditchev, you could just let that build real slow and real sweet and real deep for maybe, a good 20, 30, 40 minutes. Take you to another place. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? That was Yehuda Katz and friends singing the Berditchev Nigun, or applying that melody to a piece of the Hallel that we do at the beginning of new months and on Yom Tov when we sing extra praises to God. And they were applying it to those lines when we say, "Please, God, save us now. Please, God, enable our efforts to succeed now." Spectacular. Real tip of the hat to Yehuda Katz and friends, how they were doing that. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? Let's light up the darkness. Okay, we've got some beautiful ground to cover today. Let me pause that. Who is with us as we get it going on a Monday? Paul in Chicago, Yehuda in South Carolina, Carol in Ohio, Sharon in New Jersey, Stephen in New Hampshire, Nancy in North Carolina, Ann in Merced, Paula from the Great Northwest, Renee in Indy, Lindsay in Cincinnati, Rebecca in LA, Melissa in Great Neck, PK in Colorado, and wishing Yehudas an Erev Tov, Jane in Kansas City, loves the music. Steve in Oregon, Gwen in Michigan, Belle in Illinois, celebrating our new grandson, the second boy, Mazel Tov. And may both grandsons and all your grandchildren grow to a life of Torah, Chuppah, and Masim Tovim, a life of Torah and a good marriage and good deeds. James says shalom from Indianapolis, Sarah in LA, Randy in Florida, Gwen likes the music, Bill in Berkeley, Irene in Florida, Chaim in Charlotte, Dawn in Texas, Carolyn in Raleigh, Julie in Texas, Donna in Bahama, North Carolina. PK says a singer too, Sal. Listen, I just can't help it. The fact that I'm a terrible singer, I just cannot let it dampen my enthusiasm because I love to sing. I know I throw singers off. I can never sing on key or whatever. I feel like I don't sound terrible when I sing alone. The problem is when I try to blend in. Okay, where else am I? Tom in PA, Tom, another Tom in Myrtle Beach, Aham in Sacramento, Piero in Tours, France. Wow, it must be late for you, Piero. Bienvenue. Gloria in saying shalom. Renee loves it. And Yosef is in Massachusetts. Over there on the YouTube side, Marjorie in Georgia, Neil in Virginia, Lynn in North Texas. Welcome, everybody. A big Yasher Koach, a big thank you, and may you be strengthened to Rebecca Cohen, who is sponsoring tonight's show of AT Daily in memory of Brad Shechtman. May Brad's memory always be for a blessing. May his neshama have a great aliyah. May his soul have a great elevation in the world of souls, thanks to the merit of our learning today, which Rebecca is dedicating to his soul. And Rebecca, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings, and we say amen. This is, now it's just become official, right? This is AT Daily, the Torah and Talmud show. So always have a thought of Torah, a short thought of Torah before we dive into maybe the more advanced part of the course into Talmud. But there's no lack of depth in the short Torah bits that we do at the beginning of the show. So today, a thought from the Lubavitcher Rebbe with respect to today's reading of the Torah, right? So if we divide every weekly portion into 7 aliyahs, into 7 portions, as we do on Shabbat, when we read the weekly Torah portion in synagogue, we divide it into 7 portions, and then we could divide them over the days of the week. So today's aliyah is from Parsha Emor, and very relevant to our journey through Tractate Yoma, where we're talking about the service of the high priest on Yom Kippur. And as we've seen, to understand what the high priest does on Yom Kippur, we talk a lot about what ordinary priests and the high priest himself does the rest of the days of the year. And the laws that we were studying in last week's Torah portion and in this week's Torah portion, have a lot to do with the laws which govern the divine, the worship, the service to the divine that the priests are responsible for when the temple is standing. Tragically, not in 2000. It's been 2,000 years since the Kohanim, since the priests, and we know who the priests are. Priests know who they are. They were told by their father, right? It's a hereditary title. You cannot become a priest if you were not born a priest. And that's quite relevant to what we're going to be talking about today. People are born different. We are physically different. Some are tall, some are short, some are men, some are women. Some have this characteristic, some have that characteristic. I had a lot of red hair. Now I don't. I have hazel eyes still. And some people are differently abled. I mean, some people are born blind, some people are born deaf, some people lose these faculties over the course of their life, and we really are all different. Now, to the modern ear, when we hear certain laws from the Torah, it's very difficult to us. It sounds terribly unfair. So, for example, we have a verse from today's reading about the priest serving in the temple. It says, speak to Aaron. So this is Moses, God telling Moses, speak to your brother Aaron, the first high priest, saying, any man among your descendants throughout their generations, so all the Kohanim, all the priests, all the descendants of Aaron throughout all time, who has a defect may not approach to offer up his God's bread. What is God's bread? God doesn't need to eat, but God has told us to bring certain offerings on the altar in the temple. And so those are termed kind of poetically food of God, the food of God. God doesn't eat it, but God is pleased when we bring sacrifices because God said do it, and we did it, right? So that's a way to give pleasure to God, and that's according to Rashi's interpretation. But we're told that among the priests, now a priest can be disqualified for a lot of reasons. He can become temporarily disqualified, as we've seen, if he comes into contact with a corpse, for example. So he's ritually impure until he is purified again. He's gone through his purification process, and then he can serve in the temple once more. If he marries somebody who's not permitted to him, those laws are covered also in this parsha. Then he can become disqualified for that reason. What about a physical defect? And some of the physical defects that are mentioned in this part in today's reading. Let me just go back. So any man from the descendants of Aaron, the priest, who has a deformity, so the translation can vary, must not draw near to offer up the fire offerings of the eternal. While he has that deformity, he must not draw near to offer up the food of his God. He may eat of the food of his God, of sacrifices that are holy of holies and those that are holy, but he may not bring the offerings. And what are these kinds of deformities? Wait a minute, where is it? I think it talks about, some of them seem almost silly and some are more profound. Right, so if he has a deformity, he must not draw near to offer up the food of his God, since it is not fitting that any man who has a deformity draw near to serve. A man who is blind or lame or has a sunken nose bridge or disproportionate limbs. I mean, that sounds like something you're born with, or I guess could result from an accident. And similarly, a man who has a broken leg or a broken arm. Those are clearly temporary defects. Or drooping eyebrows, or webbing on his eye, or a blur in his eye, or a dry boil, a festering boil, or crushed testicles. So while this deformity is on him, and some of these sound like permanent defects, so he's never going to be able to bring the offerings, and some of them are going to be temporary, and when he heals from that problem, then he can bring those offerings. So this is very difficult for us to hear, where we really, in our culture, we try to celebrate the differently abled, and the last thing we would want to do is say to them, you can't do something that your abled brothers can do. So now hear how the Lubavitcher Rebbe turns this completely around. He says the pain or discomfort that these bodily defects caused those priests who possess them. And remember, only priests who are born priests could bring these offerings in the first place. So already you've separated out, like 2-3% of the population, and everybody else cannot bring these offerings at all. But even among the ones who had been, born into the priesthood, if they have these defects, now they cannot serve in the temple. Since the temple service must be performed in unmitigated joy and good cheer, and somebody who has, particularly if he's in pain from such a defect, like a broken arm or a broken leg, so he's not going to be able to bring his complete focus and concentration on bringing the offerings. However, since these priests' bodily defects reflected only a defect in the spiritual channels through which their souls passed on the way into their bodies, but in their souls themselves, these priests were not barred from partaking of sacrificial or consecrated food. So we've learned that teruma is a portion of the tithe, right, which is set aside from farmers in Israel, that the very best and first of the grain, the first part of it, 1/50th, goes to priests as teruma. This is consecrated food that only a priest can eat. Interestingly, you don't have to be born into the priesthood in order to partake of teruma. You can marry a priest and then you can eat the teruma. You can actually be a slave who's acquired by a priest and partake of his teruma, and you can be his children. But no outsider can eat of the teruma. So a priest with a defect is barred from bringing offerings in the temple, but he is not barred from eating this holy food, which other regular people cannot eat. So, says the Lubavitcher Rebbe, their defects were only external, but their inner essence was as pure as that of any other priest. Now here's the beautiful teaching. When in the messianic future, meaning when Mashiach comes, the spiritual realm will be entirely healed. Bodily defects will also disappear. When the world to come arrives here in the physical world, and this whole world becomes as filled with knowledge of God as water fills the sea, illness will go away. We've talked about war will end, strife will end, bloodshed will end, also illness will end, and with it bodily defect. We are all perfect beings when you talk about who we really are, right? We are all souls. We don't have souls, we are souls. That means we are perfect beings, we're made of light, and we are a light that was sent here from the source of light, right? From God, our creator. So at that time, when the world to come is actually here, our physical bodies will be an expression of our true selves, the souls. We are beings of light, and our bodies will reflect that. At that time, those who suffered from bodily defects until then, and now we're not just talking about priests, but anybody who was physically challenged, will have the advantage of appreciating and enjoying their newfound health to a greater extent than those who did not experience such suffering. Since they are destined to have this privilege in the world to come, we should consider it an honor and a blessing to associate with them now. Isn't that a spectacular teaching? And if you think about it just from a common sense perspective, people who suffer in this world, people who suffer physically, people who are challenged with great illness, with loss of limbs, with any kinds of physical challenges, they're going to experience difficulties and acquire an appreciation of what it means to be able to get around, to be able to feed yourself, to be able to do things that we take for granted. They will have an appreciation that we could never have unless we faced that challenge ourselves. When we are all, have bodies that reflect our essential being as beings of light, the ones who really suffered before will have such a greater appreciation of what that means that said, according to the Rebbe, we really have to honor them now because they are attaining a wisdom in this world that we cannot hope to attain unless we face similar challenges. It's a beautiful, beautiful teaching on what would otherwise seem to be such an unfair teaching in the Torah. And that's why the depth of Torah is always calling to us, and just turn it over and over and over, for everything is in it. Okay. Where are we holding? We are today studying Daf Tes Vav, right? You could say a Yud and a Hey, 10 and 5, to say page 15 in Tractate Yoma, but we don't number it that way because those letters, Yud and Hey, comprise half of God's name. So when we say that page 15, we actually say 9 and 6, just so that we don't, in a disrespectful way, employ the letters that spell half of God's name. Okay, so we're on page 15 here in Tractate Yoma, the 6th volume of the Talmud. We are in chapter 1, and we are discussing the second Mishna of chapter 1, which talks about the fact that the high priest, during the 7 days that he is sequestered in the temple, he lives in the temple compound for 7 days before Yom Kippur as he prepares for Yom Kippur, and he performs all of the daily routine that is usually assigned to other priests so that he gets very familiar with it, because on Yom Kippur, he's going to have to be the one who does these, all the avodah, all the divine service, and he has to be very fluent in all of these practices and do them very well and efficiently and expertly. And so he's kind of in a period of training as well as purification and sanctification as he prepares for Yom Kippur. That's generally what we're talking about. And the Mishnah, in talking about what he's practicing during that week, the kinds of practices that he takes over and does that normally the ordinary priest would do, but now the high priest is going to do during this week. So we're actually starting at the bottom of the B side of page 14. And the Mishnah teaches that on each of the 7 days, the high priest burns the incense and removes the ashes from the lamps of the menorah, the candelabrum, the 7-branched menorah that stood in the temple. Now, apparently, the incense is burned first, and then the lamps are cleaned. And the Gemara raises a contradiction from a Mishnah, another Mishnah in another volume of the Talmud, Tractate Talmud, that discusses the lottery in which the priests performing the various tasks that constitute the morning temple service are selected. The Mishnah first mentions that the language here is beautiful. The one who was privileged to be selected to perform removal of the ashes from the inner altar, and then the one who was privileged to be selected to remove the ashes from the lamps of the candelabrum, and only then does it deal with the one who is privileged to be selected to burn the incense. I mean, these are very mundane tasks, seemingly mundane tasks, right? Who is going to be privileged to be selected because they had a lottery every day to see who would win the prize of getting to do what? Be the cleaning man. Right? The one who's going to clean out the ashes on the altar, or clean out the burnt oil in the old wick in the cups of the candelabrum, or it sounds a little better, at least to light the incense that will make the beautiful pungent aroma throughout the temple compound, and the smoke will go straight up. But to do the cleaning the altar, shoveling the ashes, I mean, have you ever cleaned out your fireplace? It's a dirty job. But when we're talking about the divine service, to clean the altar so that it'll be ready for the new fire and the new offerings of the new day, or to clean the lamps of the candelabrum so that we can light it again and have the beautiful light that goes forth from Jerusalem out to the whole world, of course it's a privilege to do the cleaning. Okay, so the issue here that the Gemara is raising is, well, elsewhere where it's talking about, the order of the lottery and the cleaning and what goes on in the morning, it seems to contradict our Mishnah about what the high priest is being trained to do each morning. Which does he do first? Does he clean out the lamps of the candelabra and then light the incense altar? Or does he light the incense and then clean out the cups of the candelabrum? According to that Mishnah in Talmud, removing ashes from the candelabrum precedes the burning of the incense. Now, there's a lot of material on this page today that we're not going to read straight out. It gets very technical. First, there's a long discussion of, well, who said what? See, these Mishnahs contradict each other, so who's actually talking here? And it looks at a few different possibilities. Who is the rabbi of the Mishnah? Who is the Tana of the Mishnah? And is our Mishnah here in Tractate Yoma, is it in accordance with the rabbi of the Mishnah in Talmud? Is it in accordance with the rabbis who disagree with that rabbi in the other tractate? And it's a little bit beyond the scope of our conversation today. So, the Gemara, in discussing this contradiction from one Mishnah in Tractate Yoma, now talks about another Mishnah in this same tractate. And as we learned in a Mishnah, we're going to come to this later, so there were these lotteries in the morning, right? There were 3 lotteries. And the second lottery, conducted daily among the priests, determined the following. Who slaughters the daily morning offering, right? So there's daily offerings when the temple is standing. There's an animal slaughtered every morning and another one slaughtered every afternoon. And then on Shabbos and on holidays and on Rosh Chodesh, there's the Musaf, the additional offerings of the Sabbath or of the holiday. But with regard to the daily morning offering, who slaughters it? Who sprinkles its blood? And who removes the ashes from the inner altar in the sanctuary? And who, as opposed to the Holy of Holies, right? There's the inner altars in the sanctuary where the priest can enter, but there's the inner sanctuary, which is the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest can enter on Yom Kippur. But in terms of this morning lottery on a regular day, right? Who slaughters the morning offering? Who sprinkles its blood, which is what really gains atonement for the nation, is when the blood is sprinkled. Who removes the ashes from the inner altar, and who removes the ashes and the burnt wicks from the candelabrum? And who takes the limbs of the daily offering up the ramp to be burned later? Following the second lottery, the priests dispersed to do their jobs, and they later reconvened for the third lottery. Before the third lottery, the appointee declared, "Let only those priests who are new to offering the incense come and participate in the lottery for the incense." Beautiful, right? So it could be that if everybody's always there, one guy could get lucky and keep winning the lottery, but they wanted to make sure that everybody got a chance to light the incense. So let only those who are new to the offering of the incense come and participate in the lottery for the incense. And we learn from this whole idea of the two lotteries, apparently removing the ashes from the lamps of the candelabrum preceded the burning of the incense, and that contradicts our Mishnah that we're discussing here at the beginning of Tractate Yoma. So Abaye said, this is not difficult. Here, the Mishnah is discussing the removal of the ashes from 2 lamps, which is performed after the burning of the incense. And there, the Mishnah of the lotteries is discussing the removal of the ashes from 5 lamps, which precedes the burning of the incense. As will be explained, the priest attends to 5 of the 7 lamps first, and then after a break, he attends to the final 2 lamps. Now, we're going to get to that discussion later, so we're not going to talk about it here, but it's really based on the fact that the Torah seems to specify at the time of the cleaning and lighting of the lamps, you shall burn it, the incense. So do you burn the incense before cleaning the lamps, after cleaning the lamps, or during cleaning the lamps? That's another discussion that we're going to have later in our journey through this tractate. But to resolve this, and after a lot of technical discussion, Abaye finally concludes it's not difficult. And we could have said to you that the first Mishnah, which describes the routine of the high priest during his 7 days of separation, teaches a general directive describing the services with which the high priest must be familiarized prior to Yom Kippur, and is not actually listing them exactly in the order in which they happen. It was just a list of things he needs to be familiar with. Don't, read out from that this is exactly the order in which those things happen every morning. We could talk about the order later when we're specifically dealing with that subject. And in terms of the sequence, the Mishnah then teaches it in the context of the actual performance of the services when we get to that Mishnah later. From here, having introduced the idea of which rabbi said what at what time, the Gemara takes a long digression into the daily offerings, and then the offerings of the holiday, and the fact that sin offerings and burnt offerings are different kinds of offerings. A sin offering is an obligatory offering when you have unwittingly committed a transgression that would otherwise result in your being excised, right? I'm spacing, but I'll get it in a minute. But where it says that soul shall be cut off from its people. So when you suffer that fate, if you do it intentionally, if you committed such a transgression like violating Shabbos, unintentionally, then you become obligated to bring a sin offering. But the sin offering is also used as part of certain kinds of purification processes. At the end of that process, you bring a sin offering, like if you've been a Nazir, right? One who promised not to drink wine or cut his hair for a certain amount of time. At the end of that, one of the offerings that he brings is a sin offering. And burnt offerings, and only Jews bring sin offerings. A burnt offering, and so with the sin offering, right, he brings an animal. Part of that animal is burned on the altar. Part of that animal is eaten by the priest. Whereas a burnt offering, the entire animal goes up in smoke on the altar, at least almost all of it. And non-Jews can also bring burnt offerings. We're not getting into the specifics of offerings here, except that in the context of today's discussion, what they're talking about is really the key part of any offering. It's not slaughtering the animal, which you have to do it, and it's not burning the animal, it's not eating the animal. All those are parts of certain kinds of offerings, but the part that actually affects the atonement, right, that sort of binds you to this divine procedure and binds your soul, to God through the process of bringing an offering, or binds the soul of the nation to the soul of the universe. It's when the blood, a bit of the lifeblood of that animal, a few of these drops are sprinkled on the altar. And for the sin offering, it's done on 2 corners of the altar. And for the burnt offering, it's done on 4 corners of the altar. And since there are some offerings where it seems like you need to do, it's unclear which procedure you should be doing, the sages are arguing about how to handle that particular contradiction. Now, as part of that discussion, the Gemara gets into a question about, okay, so if you're going to be doing, in the northeast corner and the northeast corner and southwest corners of the altar where you have to do these 2 sprinklings for the sin offering, so which one are you going to do first? So the Gemara suggests, well, what difference does it make? You have to hit both corners, so just make sure that you hit both corners. And then the Gemara answers, no, it is not random which one you do first, because you're coming from the place where you slaughtered the animal and received its blood in a vessel, and now you're approaching the altar. And so when you approach the altar to sprinkle blood on one of these corners, well, one of them is to your right and one of them is to your left. Therefore, he has to make a right turn when he reaches the altar and sprinkle blood on that corner first. And then the question is, why do you have to make a right turn? Why do you have to make a right turn? And this is the way it says it. The master said, all turns that you turn should be only to the right. With regard to certain offerings sacrificed when the priest is on the south side of the altar, he would turn to the east, which was to his right. Since the animal to be offered is slaughtered to the north of the altar, he first sprinkles blood at the corner that he encounters first by turning to the right. Now, when I read that, and I saw that in My Jewish Learning, there's a daily email, and a rabbi named Seth Gorn, I don't know him, but he had the same thought that I had. When you hear, you must turn right, we both thought of Zoolander. If you've ever seen the movie Zoolander, it's an outrageous comedy, has nothing holy about it. It's just funny. But it's, what's his name? Stiller. Why am I spacing on his name? Somebody will put it in the comments for me. What's it? Ben Stiller. And he plays a male model who has this tragic defect, which is he cannot make a left turn, right? He can only turn to the right. And for a model on the catwalk, this is very difficult. You have to be able to turn to the right or to the left. He could only turn to the right. And so it was like his Achilles heel that he couldn't make the left turn. Right? So that's just a humorous, little thing. But we see in the Jewish tradition that the right really receives precedence in many ways. Starting with when we talk about the attributes of God, there's 2 principal channels through which God's blessing flows into this world. And they are sort of made analogous to the right. God doesn't have hands, right? God doesn't have a head and a brain. We shouldn't anthropomorphize God. But it's okay to some extent to do that because God said that we are made in God's image. So there's some manifestation of God's self that we can relate to. It's really for our benefit, not for God's. But God said, we're made in his image. Okay, we have a right hand and we have a left hand. And so when you talk about, this is the mystical side of Judaism, the right hand of God represents God's attribute of chesed, loving kindness. And the left hand of God represents restraint or judgment, right? So the right hand is sort of mercy, and the left hand is, justice, right? A God who exacts justice from his creatures. If God judged us only with justice and gave us everything we deserved, who could survive? Because we all make so many mistakes. Luckily, God allows his attribute of mercy to overpower his attribute of justice. And in that sense, we say that the right hand is stronger than the left hand, and the right hand is more privileged. Now, really what you're always seeking is a balance, and we are seeking this in our own lives and in our own sort of personal traits and makeup. We're balancing an urge that if we don't have it naturally, we should develop it strongly to treat our fellow humans with loving kindness. However, you can overdo loving kindness, right? And if you are merciful to the wicked, you will end up being wicked to the good, right? You will end up being, if you're too good to the wicked, you will end up being wicked to the good. If you're too good, if you're too merciful and you don't punish people who really have transgressed, the obvious example, somebody's a murderer, you feel bad for him and the way he grew up, and so you say, well, let's not put him in prison, and then he ends up murdering another person. So that was not a good thing you did in being too merciful to the murderer. Nevertheless, while we should always develop our mercy, and we should always try to balance it with our attribute of justice and restraint and good judgment. When they're really evenly balanced, we just give a hair's precedence to mercy and to loving kindness, because we hope that God will give his loving kindness at least a hair's precedence over his judgment toward us. And so that's another place where we say the right is stronger than the left. Now, if you're a left-handed person, this is difficult to hear, right? I believe 10% of the population is left-handed. And it seems that the tradition says right is better than left. So if you're left-handed, that seems unfair. You weren't born that way. You didn't choose to be left-handed. But now when we couple that with our teaching at the beginning of class, right, anybody who is different, and if you think about it, all of us bear some kind of a difference that makes us a little bit of an oddball in some realm of our lives. But some people obviously face much bigger challenges than other people in this world, right? And even if you spend a lifetime suffering because of physical challenges that you have, remember, you are a soul. You are a being of light. You are an eternal being. If you live here 70, 80 years, if you happen to be so blessed you live to be 100 or even 120 years, compared to your eternal self, it's not that long. However, the more of these challenges that you face in this world, the greater opportunity you actually have to gather wisdom. And people who have an easy life are not going to gather as much wisdom as people who have a tough life. So it's something really worth remembering, about all physical challenges, even being left-handed. Okay, that's actually everything that I wanted to cover from today's page. It is such a challenging page in terms of authorship of the various Mishnayos and exactly where we're going to sprinkle the blood on the altar, that I just didn't want to get too lost in the weeds on that. But now I am coming to your questions and comments. Perhaps there will be one or two. So let me check that. And I'm sorry I didn't give you the warning. I always try to give a warning when I'm almost done. Tom Maxwell. I had 2 brain aneurysms 7 years ago. I was in a coma for 2 months and was not supposed to survive. Thank God you did, Tom. Thank you for sharing. But Hashem intervened and I lived. And now I appreciate each day as a gift. This is what it will be like when Mashiach comes. Exactly. Right? So, Tom, this is a classic type of story. You suffered a terrible, terrific, an extreme physical challenge, 2 brain aneurysms, a coma for 2 months. You weren't supposed to survive. Imagine tremendous anguish to your family. And when you came around and were recovering, I'm sure that wasn't an overnight recovery. And yet you come out of this experience with an incredible appreciation for life, with a sense of gratitude, and with all kinds of perspective and wisdom that you would not have acquired otherwise. So we don't wish on anybody that they should have these kinds of physical challenges, but we hear the story over and over again that people who have had such challenges do acquire this kind of learning. Let me just mention, last night after our class, when I teach this class, right, it's like, how can I put it? I enjoy it very much. I love being with you. It just costs me a certain amount of energy. And so after the class, it's like, okay, I need a break before I can do anything else. So we were just kind of like, settling in, having a little dinner, relaxing a little bit. And then a notification came in our local WhatsApp group, 6-year-old boy missing. I ended up posting about it on our page last night, but a 6-year-old boy went missing, and we had, come help join the search party. It was amazing how the community turned out last night. We live in a pretty diverse community. There's a lot of religious Jews who live in the neighborhood where we live, But there's also, a lot of kind of like, just like white people who've been here for many decades, and Korean people live here, and Chinese people live here, black people live here. It's quite diverse. But the word went out. A 6-year-old boy is missing. And man, people came out of their homes. The religious Jewish community is very networked, so we all heard about it. And there were just hundreds of people out on the street. But then part of searching for the boy was they assigned blocks, and you went up and down the block calling the boy's name, knocking on doors, letting people know. And as people heard about it who weren't part of the religious Jewish community, who weren't even Jewish, they joined the search. It was an extraordinary thing to watch a community come together. Let's find this boy. In the end, thank God, the boy was found. It was kind of like an extraordinary circumstance what happened. He was safe all along. He had not been kidnapped. He had basically like fallen asleep in a place where nobody could find him. And then thank God they found him. And so, I was like, as I was walking up and down this block 10 times, calling out his name, and I was imagining, and I was praying, we were all praying, please God, just as we, the search party, and this 6-year-old boy are revealed before you, so too may it be your will that he be revealed to us, that we find him. And I was just praying that over and over and over again. And I was imagining what it would be like when he's found. I just kept imagining, we're going to find him. Please, God, let us find him. And it'll feel so good when we find him. And then that moment happened. It was so great. And I kudos to my friend Alex Leventhal, who lives in another part of town. And he heard about this, and he drove over so he could join the search party. And a lot of people did the same thing. So it was a terrible, terrible scare for the community. And it should never happen. It should never, ever happen. But it did happen. And once it did happen, and the fact that it happened on Pesach Sheni, which I mentioned yesterday, the second Passover, which we talked a lot about during our journey through Tractate Pesachim, the laws of Passover, and we learned that somebody who was ritually impure during Passover, when the temple was standing, he couldn't bring the Korban Pesach, the Passover offering, but he had another chance a month later. And it was like this on this holiday. It's like a very minor holiday because the temple isn't here now, so we don't do much on Pesach Sheni except maybe eat matzah. But it's thematically all about second chances and how God never gives up on us. And why are we missing the temple for 2,000 years? We just learned this a few days ago, right? The second temple was destroyed because of baseless hatred within the Jewish community. We couldn't get along with each other, and so we didn't merit to have the temple in our midst. But here, there was an emergency in the neighborhood, and every Jew of every color and every stripe just came out, and the unity was amazing. And when the word went out that the boy was found, there was literally dancing in the streets. It's a tremendous thing. So it should never happen to any family or any neighborhood or any community. But it did happen, and we were able to attain, this measure of learning that we wouldn't have had otherwise. Renee, my mother, Zichrona Livracha, my mother of blessed memory, told us that it's not knowing how to sing that counts. It's not, wait a minute. Yeah, she said, Renee's mother said that it's not that not knowing how to, it's not knowing how to sing that counts. It's feeling like you want to sing that's key. Nice way to pat a novice singer like me on the head. Exactly. So, Renee, your mother agrees with me, right? You should never let the fact that we're bad singers or, just can't sing on key. We throw other people off. And then what happens in this society is that people are told when they're young, well, you can't sing. And then you get shy and embarrassed about it. Then you never get to enjoy the tremendous joy, the great pleasure of singing. That's a terrible thing to tell a child. It's not a physical defect, but it's a kind of, being disabled if people, okay, you can't sing. Now, some people are beautiful singers, some people are just competent singers, and some people just can't sing on key. But to then tell that person you're a bad singer so they get embarrassed and then they can never join in singing and get the great pleasure of singing, terrible thing to tell a child. Never tell a child they can't sing. Okay, Aham Svarupa. Who are the sages presuming to be these non-Jews that would be bringing offerings? Would they be the Gerim, the strangers in the land, God-fearers, Noahides, others? No. In fact, when the temple was standing, there were, kings from other kingdoms that would send an offering to be brought on the temple. During Sukkot in particular, we would bring 70 bulls over the course of that week, which was understood to represent the 70 nations, like that we're bringing offerings on behalf of the nations. But then, people from the other nations would actually bring offerings in the temple. And when the third temple comes, that will be possible again. Yes, non-Jews can bring elevation offerings in the temple. I mean, there's going to be a whole procedure, and it's not like, if suddenly 8 billion people wanted to bring offerings and there wasn't going to be space for the Jews to bring their offerings, they'd have to figure out how to deal with that. But yes, it was possible for non-Jews, just totally non-Jews, even if they weren't residents of Israel, to bring offerings in the temple. Bell Plumber, I was very impressed that the slave of a priest can still eat from the holy food. Another example, right? If we tune into this idea that we don't have souls, we are souls, right? Then it's a very short human life that we lead here. And if it's just a life lived in comfort, how much are we really going to learn? Right? And the more challenges, the more difficulties we face, the more tests we face in this world, the more possibility we have to learn from this journey. Now, what could be more challenging? What could be more terrible than losing all your personal freedom, either because you're imprisoned or because you're enslaved? And yet, the slave can eat of the holy food, which even, a super wealthy and prominent and respected sage, right? A sage of the Jewish people, unless he's a Cohen, he cannot eat that holy food. But the slave of a Cohen, the slave of a priest, could. Now, when the third temple comes, I suspect that law will not be in practice because, thank God, slavery's gone from this world, or at least it should be gone. We're trying to root it out anywhere that, any kind of human trafficking that still exists. But Jews have not owned slaves in thousands of years. That was the world in which the Torah was given. Slavery was very common. That's one of the beautiful practices. It's beautiful that we've evolved out of that practice, and that's not one we need to bring back. Carolyn, I was supposed to be left-handed, but my mom wouldn't let me use it as I entered school. Isn't that amazing? Right? That's a difference between, from a few decades ago and now. It used to be that kids that were left-handed would be sort of forced to learn how to write right-handed, throw right-handed. Now that could be very difficult on the child, but it could end up resulting in them being ambidextrous. I don't know. This is not an experience that I've had, but that's obviously something we don't do anymore, where now we celebrate different abilities. Interesting. Judy, I too was left-handed, and my mother made me switch to my right. But there are still things I do with my left hand that most right-handed people don't do. I don't write with it, and I don't write pretty with it, but I do go grab things with my left hand, and I do use it more than most people use their left hand. Very interesting. Thank you, Judy. And finally, Belle says, my husband is left-handed. His parents, both educators, would not let him be interfered with at school. He is quite successful, but doesn't cut with any kind of scissors. But I guess if you're left-handed, right-handed scissors are really a problem. I actually find scissors very interesting. And I actually think, how do they really work, right? And the whole thing is, they're two blades that have to be pushed into each other for it to work. So if you're a right-handed person, and most scissors are right-handed scissors, so then you put them in your left hand, it's almost impossible to cut with them, and you have to kind of train yourself to push-pull on the holds of the scissors so that those blades will push into each other, and then they'll cut. But it's very difficult to get used to. Nevertheless, interesting. All right, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow for page 16 here in Tractate Yoma. All the best and have a great night. And may we hear no new thing. Given the emergency and the panic of last night, now you can see why that's a great blessing. May we hear no new thing, unless it's that Mashiach came.